I was 34 years old when my father stood beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom in Atlanta, raised a champagne glass worth more than my monthly rent, and decided to erase me in front of 300 people because this was not just a celebration, it was the 50th anniversary gala of Whitmore Biomedical, the company my father, Richard Whitmore, had built into a medical device empire. And the room was packed with senators, hospital executives, surgeons, investors, and journalists, all dressed in black tie, all waiting for his legacy announcement, while I stood near the back of the ballroom in a navy blue dress I had bought on clearance. My hands folded, my spine straight, already sensing something sharp moving toward me the way you sense a storm before the first drop of rain. My brothers were seated near the stage, Thomas at 45 with his confident smile, and Andrew at 41 with his hand already resting possessively on the arm of his wife. Both of them relaxed, polished, certain of what was coming because this night had been designed for them, not for me. My father tapped the microphone and the room fell silent instantly the way it always did when he spoke, and he began talking about vision, discipline, growth, about how Whitmore Biomedical had changed modern medicine, about how legacy was not about kindness, but about strength. And with every word, I felt my chest tighten because I had heard these speeches my entire life, always delivered like sermons, always ending with judgment. Then he announced the numbers clearly, confidently, without hesitation: $80 million in combined assets, equity and trusts to be divided between my two sons, Thomas and Andrew. Applause exploding so loudly it rattled the glassware flashes from cameras lighting their faces as they stood and accepted handshakes. Smiles wide, victorious, already heirs in every sense that mattered to my father. I did not clap. I did not move. I felt the weight of something unfinished hanging in the air, and I was right. My father waited for the noise to settle, then he cleared his throat and said my name. Eleanor Whitmore. Slowly, deliberately. The way you say something unpleasant you have rehearsed, and every head in the room turned toward me. The forgotten daughter suddenly dragged into the light. I walked forward because I knew better than to hesitate, because I had spent my life learning how not to embarrass him, and when I reached the edge of the stage, he did not offer me his hand. He did not smile. He simply looked at me with that familiar expression of disappointment that had shaped my childhood more than any praise ever could. Eleanor chose a different path. He said, his voice calm, clinical, almost bored, while I stood there, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. She chose compassion over competence, caregiving over leadership, and while that may be admirable in a personal sense, it has no place in the future of this company. There was a murmur in the crowd. Soft laughter, nods of agreement, the kind people make when they think they are watching something honest rather than cruel. Then he delivered the line that split something open inside me. Eleanor has contributed nothing of strategic value to this legacy, and in that sense, she has made herself useless. Useless. He said it clearly, without anger, without emotion, as if it were a fact written on a balance sheet, and the room responded exactly as he expected. Polite applause at first, then stronger approval rippling outward as if my humiliation were a necessary footnote to his greatness. I stood there under the lights with every camera angled toward my face, and I did not cry, I did not speak, I did not ask why, because at that moment something in me went very still, very quiet the way it does when you realize the worst thing has already happened and nothing you say can stop it. My father lifted his glass again, turned away from me, and toasted the future, while I turned and walked back into the crowd alone, knowing that what had just happened was not the end of my story, even if everyone in that room believed it was. I walked away from the stage with my back straight and my hands steady, even though my palms were damp because I had learned long ago that dignity was the only armor my father could not strip from me, and as I moved through the crowd, I became invisible again, which was somehow worse than being humiliated, because people who had been smiling at me minutes earlier now looked through me as if I were a misplaced coat rack, and I could hear fragments of conversation float past my ears. Comments about succession planning, about smart business, about how some people simply were not built for leadership, and none of them used my name, because once a person is labeled useless, they stop being a person at all. Near the bar, I heard Thomas laugh, a low, satisfied sound I recognized from childhood, The same laugh he used when he won and I lost, and Andrew leaned in toward him and said something I could not hear, but I saw the smirk that followed the same shared expression they wore whenever my father had chosen them, and not me, which had been most days of our lives. I reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed something solid to hold something real, and my fingers brushed the cold crystal, just as the waiter pulled it back, startled, apologizing as if I were the one who had made a mistake by existing in his path. I nodded and thanked him anyway because politeness had been drilled into me the way ambition had been drilled into my brothers, and it was too deeply rooted to abandon now. The ballroom felt too warm, too loud, the air thick with perfume and triumph, and every step toward the exit felt like wading through resistance, not physical, but emotional, as if the room itself wanted me to stay and absorb my place at the bottom of the story. It was telling. When I finally reached the marble hallway outside the ballroom, the noise dimmed to a distant hum, and I stopped walking. Not because I wanted to, but because my legs suddenly refused to carry me any farther, and I stood there staring at my reflection in the mirrored wall. A composed woman in her mid-30s, with her hair pinned neatly back and her shoulders squared, looking nothing like the useless thing my father had just described, and yet feeling the old familiar pull of doubt that had followed me since childhood. A woman in a silver gown brushed past me and murmured, "Excuse me," without looking up, and in that moment, I realized that no one was going to come after me. No one was going to say this was wrong. No one was going to correct the narrative that had just been declared from a stage with a microphone and applause. This was how stories hardened into truth, not because they were accurate, but because they were repeated by powerful people in public places. I inhaled slowly and let the breath out through my nose the way I taught families to do when they were standing beside hospital beds saying goodbye. And I thought about how strange it was that I was more comfortable with death than I was with my own family. How sitting with strangers in their final moments felt more honest than standing in a room full of blood relatives celebrating my erasure. As I turned toward the exit doors, I heard my father's voice again, booming with laughter, now confident, energized, already free of me. And I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. This was not an emotional outburst, not a mistake, not a moment he would later regret in private. This was intentional, a message delivered exactly as designed, and my silence, which everyone in that ballroom interpreted as weakness, was the only thing keeping me intact. Because if I had spoken, then, if I had tried to defend myself in that room, I would have been arguing inside a system built to crush me, and I was done offering myself up for that kind of sacrifice. My father had always spoken about his children the way other men spoke about assets with projected returns and acceptable losses, and from the moment I was old enough to understand his tone, I knew exactly where I stood on that ledger because I was not a son, and therefore I was never an investment worth nurturing. When I was 8 years old and my mother Margaret began chemotherapy, it was not my brothers who sat beside her bed during the long nights when the pain made sleep impossible. It was me perched on a vinyl chair with my feet barely touching the floor, holding a cup of ice chips and listening to the rhythm of her breathing so I could tell when it changed. Thomas was already being groomed, then flown to conferences with my father, introduced to board members as the future, while Andrew followed close behind, sharp and ambitious, absorbing the language of power as naturally as breathing. I learned a different language, the language of quiet rooms, and whispered reassurances of medication schedules taped to refrigerators of how to fold yourself smaller so someone else could rest. My father praised efficiency and control, and he never once thanked me for taking on responsibilities that no child should have carried, because caregiving did not register as value in his world. It registered as distraction. By the time I was 12, I could change a dressing, prepare bland meals, and coax my mother into taking pills that made her nauseous. And when she finally died, thin and exhausted, my father stood at the front of the church and spoke about resilience and strength, never once mentioning the daughter who had held his wife's hand until the very end. After the funeral, he sent me to stay with an aunt for a month, explaining that the house needed to return to normal, and normal did not include reminders of loss. My brothers returned to their routines almost immediately, school tutors, summer programs, while I learned how easily a child could be set aside when her usefulness was no longer convenient. In high school, I volunteered at a local hospice because the environment felt familiar, because suffering made sense to me in a way my own family never had, and when I told my father I wanted to study nursing, he laughed not unkindly but dismissively, as if I had announced a phase rather than a vocation. "Nurses do not run companies, Eleanor," he said, and I understood then that he had already written my future off long before any of my choices were made. My brothers were sent to private universities without question. Their tuition paid their apartments, furnished their internships arranged through my father's network, while I applied for scholarships, worked night shifts at a diner, and learned how to stretch a paycheck so thin it barely existed. When I graduated and accepted a position in hospice care, my father did not attend the ceremony, citing a scheduling conflict, and later told friends that I had opted out of ambition, that I preferred the smallness of caring roles to the pressure of leadership. It did not matter that I was good at what I did, that families trusted me in the worst moments of their lives, that I coordinated care with a precision my father would have admired if it had produced profit, because none of that translated into the currency he respected. To him, I was the daughter who absorbed pain quietly and asked for nothing, the one who would always show up and never demand recognition, and that made me easy to ignore. Standing in that ballroom after he called me useless, I realized that this verdict had been forming for decades, shaped by a belief system that equated worth with dominance and dismissed empathy as weakness. And I understood that the cruelty of that night was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of a family dynamic that had taught me to give endlessly without expecting anything in return. There were things my mother understood about my father that I did not fully grasp until much later, truths she carried quietly while the rest of the world admired his confidence and mistook his control for integrity. And when I think back now, I see how carefully she tried to prepare me without ever saying his name out loud. Margaret Whitmore was not a weak woman, despite how illness softened her body and before the cancer reduced her strength. She had been a meticulous observer of people, especially the man she married, because she knew that survival inside a powerful family often depended on seeing danger early and choosing the right moment to respond. During the months when she was still well enough to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, she would ask me questions that felt strange at the time. Whether I felt obligated to always put others first, whether I believed love should require silence, whether I understood that kindness without boundaries could be exploited, and I answered the way daughters often do, assuming she was simply trying to comfort herself as her health declined. On the afternoon before her final hospital admission, she asked me to sit with her alone. The house unusually quiet because my father had taken my brothers to a conference, and she took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly firm, and told me something that stayed with me long after she was gone. "Eleanor," she said, "there will come a day when you will be told that you are nothing, and when that day comes, you must remember that people who need to diminish others are usually hiding something that cannot survive the light." At the time, I thought she was talking about grief, about how loss could make people cruel, and I nodded, promising her I would be strong, not realizing that she was warning me about a reckoning she believed was inevitable. After she died, my father closed her office within a week, instructing the staff to remove her files and personal effects. And when I asked what happened to her journals, the ones she used to keep detailed notes about household finances and correspondence, he told me they were unnecessary clutter and had been disposed of, and I accepted that explanation because I had been trained to accept his decisions without question. What I did not know then was that my mother had never been careless, never thrown anything away without purpose, and the idea that she would simply leave no record of her thoughts was inconsistent with everything I knew about her. Years later, during one of our rare private conversations, she surfaced again in my father's words, not as a memory to be honored, but as a cautionary tale, when he told me that excessive curiosity had been her flaw, that she worried too much about details that did not concern her, and that it was better for everyone when women trusted the men who knew how to lead. I remember feeling a cold clarity settle over me at that moment because it was the first time I understood that my mother's silence near the end of her life had not been resignation, but strategy. She had seen something she could not immediately fight, and instead of confronting it head-on, she had chosen to observe, to document, and to wait for a future in which the truth could no longer be buried. Standing in that hotel hallway after my father publicly erased me, I heard her voice in my mind with an intensity that made my throat tighten, reminding me that the measure of a person is not determined by who applauds them, but by what remains when the applause fades. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that the story my father told about himself was incomplete, that the legacy he celebrated so loudly might rest on foundations my mother had quietly learned to question, and that whatever she had seen before her death had been important enough for her to entrust to time, patience, and to the daughter she believed would one day need to understand it. I was halfway to the parking garage when I heard my name spoken softly but urgently, not amplified by a microphone or sharpened for an audience, just a human voice cutting through the echo of my heels against polished stone. And when I turned, I saw a man I had not seen in more than a decade standing beneath the recessed lights near the valet desk. His posture careful, his expression tight with restraint. Samuel Green was 67 then, though his shoulders still held the square discipline of a man who had spent his life navigating rooms filled with power, and for a moment I wondered if grief had distorted my memory, because I had only ever known him as a background presence from my childhood, my mother's lawyer, a quiet observer who spoke rarely and listened constantly. "Eleanor," he said again, stepping closer, his voice lowered. "I am sorry to stop you like this, but I have been waiting for tonight for a very long time." The words sent a ripple of unease through me because nothing about that night had felt accidental, and the idea that someone else had been anticipating it made the air feel heavier. Samuel told me my father would not notice his absence from the ballroom, not with investors to impress and victories to savor, and he gestured toward a small seating area tucked away from the main corridor where the noise from the gala faded into a distant murmur. We sat, and for a moment neither of us spoke, as if both of us were deciding how much truth the other could bear. Then Samuel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thin folder worn at the edges, its tabs neatly labeled in his precise handwriting. "Your mother asked me to keep this," he said, sliding it across the table toward me without letting go, "and she was very specific about when it was to be given to you. Not before, not privately, only after your father made his intentions clear in public." I stared at the folder, my pulse quickening, because the mention of my mother in the present tense always felt like a violation of time, and I asked him why he had waited so long, why he had not come to me years earlier when I was struggling, working double shifts, building a life without any support from the family that had resources to spare. Samuel's grip tightened slightly, and he exhaled before answering. "Because your father fired me 10 years ago for asking questions he did not like, and because your mother understood something I did not at the time, that the truth would only protect you if it arrived when you no longer needed his approval." He finally released the folder, and I felt its weight settle into my hands heavier than paper should be heavier with implication, and he looked at me with an intensity that made it clear this was not an act of kindness, but a transfer of responsibility. "Inside that folder," he continued, "is a copy of the original will your mother drafted with me before her death, along with documentation showing how and when it was altered, and there is more, but you cannot read it here. Not tonight, not until you are somewhere safe and alone." I asked him what he expected me to do with it, whether he was asking me to fight my father to challenge the narrative that had just been cemented in front of hundreds of witnesses, and Samuel shook his head slowly, his expression resolute, but not unkind. "I am not asking you to do anything, Eleanor," he said. "I am telling you that your father's version of events is not the only one that exists, and that your mother made provisions for the moment when you would finally be ready to see that clearly." As he stood to leave, he paused and added one final sentence that followed me all the way to my car, spoken without drama, without promise, and therefore impossible to ignore. "The will does not just redistribute money, it exposes patterns, and patterns, when documented properly, tend to attract federal attention." I did not open the folder in the parking garage or in the car, even though every instinct urged me to tear it apart immediately because Samuel's warning echoed in my head, and because some truths demand a controlled environment the same way bad news is never delivered in hallways. I drove back to my small townhouse on the edge of Asheville, the contrast between the gala and my quiet street almost disorienting, and once inside I locked the door, turned off my phone, and sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten countless late dinners after long shifts, the folder resting in front of me like a coiled wire. When I finally opened it, the first thing I saw was my mother's handwriting, precise and unmistakable, labeling a document original testamentary intent, and beneath it a date from 12 years ago, weeks before her death. The will itself was not dramatic in tone, not sentimental, but it was clear, deliberate, and nothing like the version my father had circulated to the family after the funeral, because in this document my mother had not treated me as an afterthought or a liability, but as a safeguard. She had placed specific assets in trust, intellectual property connected to early medical device patents, contingency clauses tied to transparency requirements, and a no-contest provision that would activate only if the will were altered without mutual consent. As I read further, my hands began to shake, not from shock but from recognition, because this was my mother's voice. Cautious, strategic, unwilling to rely on goodwill where power was concerned. The next section contained amendments not in her handwriting but in a different script entirely, with dates that did not align with known medical records. Signatures that looked correct at a glance but felt wrong in subtle ways, as if someone had practiced them, and attached to those pages were certified notes from a forensic document examiner explaining why the ink composition and pressure patterns indicated post-dated alterations. I realized then that my father had not simply rewritten history, he had engineered it, confident that no one would challenge him because the only person who might have cared had been taught to stay quiet. The final pages of the folder contained correspondence between Samuel and an estate compliance consultant outlining irregularities in trust, reporting delayed disclosures, and income streams routed through shell entities that intersected with Medicare reimbursement channels. The kind of technical detail that would bore most people, but made my stomach drop because I understood exactly what it implied. This was not just a family dispute. It was a structural deception, one that had benefited from my silence as much as it had relied on my father's authority. What struck me most was a short, handwritten note from my mother, tucked into the back, folded, carefully addressed simply to Ellie, in which she wrote that she believed my father would assume I would never contest him, that he would underestimate me because he mistook compassion for compliance, and that if I ever held this letter in my hands, it meant he had proven her right. She did not ask me to act, did not tell me to seek revenge. She only reminded me that truth, when documented, has a way of protecting the people who were never meant to survive the lie. As I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by evidence that my family's public triumph was built on private manipulation, I understood the twist my mother had engineered with terrifying clarity. She had not left me money or power. She had left me leverage. Knowing that leverage applied at the right moment could force accountability in ways confrontation never could. I slept for less than 3 hours that night, not because I was afraid of what I had read, but because it reframed every sacrifice I had ever made as something my father had counted on rather than appreciated, and that realization burned hotter than anger. For most of my adult life, I had believed that choosing a quieter path meant choosing less conflict, less harm, less damage, and I had accepted the trade-offs without complaint. Working nights, weekends, holidays, missing birthdays and weddings because patients were dying and families needed someone steady to stand beside them when the room felt like it was closing in. I had canceled dates without explanation, watched friendships fade from neglect, and learned to live with the small loneliness that comes from always being the reliable one, the woman people leaned on but never lifted up, and I told myself that this was simply the cost of meaningful work. What I saw now was that my silence had not merely been tolerated by my family, it had been exploited because every hour I spent caring for strangers was an hour. My father felt confident I would never spend questioning him, and every dollar I chose not to pursue was another reason he believed I lacked the appetite for conflict required to threaten his control. My brothers had learned early that aggression was rewarded, that pushing harder earned more space, more money, more praise, while I learned the opposite lesson, that restraint kept the peace and empathy earned survival. And somewhere along the way, that lesson hardened into a habit that made me predictable to people who understood power far better than compassion. I thought about the times I had stepped in quietly to smooth over family disputes, the way I had defended my father to relatives when they questioned his absence from my life, the way I had redirected conversations when people asked why I was never involved in the company. And I saw those moments now as small acts of self-erasure that had trained everyone around me to expect nothing from me except compliance. Even my career, which I had chosen out of genuine conviction, had been shaped by that pattern because hospice care rewards presence without recognition, emotional labor without applause, and I had become so fluent in absorbing pain that I barely noticed when it was directed at me. Reading my mother's note forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth that goodness without boundaries does not neutralize harm, it enables it, and that the virtues I had been praised for in private had made me invisible in public, especially to a man who measured worth by how much fear it inspired. Yet alongside that bitterness came something steadier and more dangerous clarity, because for the first time I understood that my sacrifices had not made me weak. They had made me uniquely qualified to see patterns others ignored, to notice inconsistencies, to endure long processes without losing focus, the very skills required to unravel something as entrenched as my father's deception. I did not suddenly feel powerful or vindicated. I felt tired, deeply tired, but it was the kind of fatigue that comes before a necessary decision, not the exhaustion of surrender. Sitting at that kitchen table as dawn crept in through the blinds, I made a choice that surprised me with its simplicity. I would not confront my father. I would not warn my brothers, and I would not attempt to negotiate a private resolution because private resolutions were how this system had survived for decades. Instead, I would treat this the way I treated every complex medical situation in my professional life, methodically, ethically, and with the understanding that short-term discomfort was often the price of long-term survival. My mother had trusted me not because I was ruthless, but because I was patient, and as I gathered the documents back into their folder, I realized that patience, when combined with evidence, could be far more disruptive than anger ever had. I contacted Samuel Green 2 days later, not from my phone, but from a landline at the hospice center after my shift ended because old habits of caution die hard, and because by then, I understood that discretion was not paranoia, it was preparation. Samuel did not sound surprised when I told him I had read everything only resolute, as if he had been bracing for this conversation since the night my mother died, and he asked me one question before anything else. Are you prepared for this to stop being a family matter? I told him I was, even though my voice shook slightly when I said it, because the truth is, readiness does not feel like confidence. It feels like a willingness to keep going when the outcome is no longer controllable. Samuel explained that the irregularities in the trusts and the altered will were only the surface, that when documentation like this intersected with federally regulated reimbursement streams, particularly Medicare and Medicaid, it triggered mandatory reporting obligations. And once those mechanisms were engaged, the process would move far beyond anything my father could manage with influence or intimidation. He had already consulted a forensic accountant, a former federal auditor named Helen Price, who specialized in tracing complex asset flows through layered entities, and when she reviewed the materials my mother had preserved, she flagged patterns consistent with intentional misreporting, not clerical error patterns that suggested years of deliberate obfuscation designed to inflate valuations and conceal conflicts of interest. Within a week, Helen had identified discrepancies significant enough to warrant a referral to the Department of Justice, and Samuel told me plainly that once that referral was made, there would be no discreet settlement, no quiet amendment, no option to put the truth back in its container. I listened as he spoke the clinical tone familiar to me from years of delivering bad news to families, and I recognized the same inevitability I heard when doctors explained that treatment options had been exhausted. The referral went out on a Thursday afternoon, and by Monday morning, Samuel informed me that the case had been assigned to a federal investigative team specializing in healthcare fraud and estate manipulation, the kind of unit that did not move quickly but moved thoroughly. I was instructed not to contact my father or my brothers, not to hint at what was unfolding, and not to discuss the matter with anyone outside a narrow circle of counsel, because premature disclosure could compromise the integrity of the investigation. That silence was harder than I expected, not because I wanted to warn them, but because I was accustomed to explaining myself to smoothing confusion before it hardened into resentment. And this time explanation was a luxury I could not afford. Over the following weeks, my life settled into an unsettling dual rhythm. Days spent coordinating end-of-life care nights, spent responding to measured inquiries from investigators who asked precise questions about timelines access and my mother's habits questions. I answered carefully, truthfully, without embellishment because I understood that credibility was my most valuable asset now. The investigators never raised their voices or made promises, but their presence loomed larger than any confrontation I had ever imagined because it represented a system that did not care who my father was or how loudly he had been applauded. What struck me most was how invisible I remained to my family during this time, how my brothers continued posting celebratory updates about the company's future, how my father gave interviews about succession and stability, unaware that the very documents he believed buried were being dissected line by people trained to see exactly what he had tried to hide. I felt no triumph watching this unfold, only a quiet, steady sense of alignment, as if something long distorted was slowly being corrected by forces that did not require my anger to function. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I sat alone in my car and allowed myself a single, honest thought that whatever happened next would not be about punishment or vindication, but about removing a false narrative that had shaped my life and many others, and that once removed, it would leave consequences in its wake that no amount of regret could undo. The notice of the federal hearing did not arrive with drama or warning. It arrived the way serious things always do, quietly, formally delivered to offices and legal departments before it ever reached the evening news, and by the time my father realized what was happening, the machinery was already in motion. I was not present in the room when investigators first met with Whitmore biomedical executives, but I was copied on enough correspondence to understand the shift in tone, the sudden precision of language, the way confidence gave way to caution when influence stopped working. Within weeks, subpoenas were issued, trust records requested, and compliance officers who had once deferred to my father began to distance themselves, careful to document every interaction because loyalty dissolves quickly when liability enters the conversation. The hearing itself was scheduled in a federal courthouse in Charlotte, framed publicly as a procedural review of estate compliance and healthcare reimbursement practices. But anyone paying attention understood it was something more consequential, a point of no return, where narratives collide with evidence. I sat in the gallery on the morning it began, not as a participant, not as a plaintiff, but as an observer, because that was my role now, to witness rather than intervene, and the distance gave me a strange clarity. My father entered the courtroom flanked by counsel, his posture rigid, his expression controlled the same expression he wore when delivering bad news to subordinates. He believed should have known better, but there was a difference I could not ignore. He did not look at me, not once, and that avoidance spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Thomas and Andrew sat behind him, their tailored suits immaculate, their confidence brittle because they had built their identities on inevitability. And inevitability does not survive scrutiny. When the proceedings began, there was no grandstanding, no raised voices, only methodical questions, timelines laid out with care, documents projected onto screens where discrepancies could not be argued away, signatures compared, dates aligned, financial flows traced from source to outcome. I watched my father's jaw tighten as the altered will was introduced into the record, watched his attorney attempt to frame the changes as administrative necessity, and watched that argument collapse under forensic testimony that left no room for interpretation. The most devastating moment came not with accusation, but with comparison, when my mother's original testamentary intent was read alongside the amended version, and the contrast made motive impossible to deny. My father finally spoke, then requesting a recess. His voice clipped, controlled, but the request was denied because federal proceedings do not pause for discomfort. As the hours passed, the scope widened, estate manipulation intersecting with misreported licensing arrangements, shell entities overlapping with reimbursement channels, a pattern emerging that suggested not oversight, but design. I felt my hands tremble slightly in my lap, not from fear, but from the weight of realization, because this was larger than my family, larger than my childhood, larger even than the company. This was about how easily power can normalize wrongdoing when no one believes the quiet ones will ever speak. When the judge concluded the session outlining next steps and potential charges pending further review, The room exhaled collectively, and in that release, I saw something crack in my brothers, a recognition that the future they had been promised was no longer guaranteed. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited questions, shouted statements requested, and my father declined to comment, his silence suddenly interpreted not as strength, but as strategy. I walked past the crowd, unnoticed, the irony sharp enough to sting, because invisibility had finally become a shield rather than a wound. And as I drove away, I understood that the story my father had told about me, about uselessness and irrelevance, was unraveling in real time. Not because I had fought him publicly, but because the truth, once placed in the right hands, does not require permission to be heard. The fallout did not arrive all at once. And that was perhaps the cruelest part for my father and my brothers, because there was no single moment they could point to and call the end, only a series of doors closing quietly, one after another, each one irreversible. First came the Administrative Actions Board meetings postponed indefinitely, pending reviews announced in carefully worded press releases, partnerships placed on hold, while compliance teams reassessed exposure. And within days, the confidence that had once insulated my family from accountability began to evaporate. Banks requested additional documentation, insurers revised risk profiles, and auditors asked questions that could not be brushed aside with reputation or charm, because reputation does not satisfy regulators and charm does not reconcile ledgers. When the asset freeze was ordered, it was presented as a precautionary measure, temporary and procedural, but everyone involved understood what it meant, that the flow of money my father had controlled for decades was no longer his to direct, that the leverage he once wielded with ease had been transferred to institutions that did not care how many galas he had hosted. Thomas tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, issuing a statement about transparency and cooperation, but his words rang hollow even to him because cooperation implies consent, and this process had been triggered without their approval. Andrew reacted differently, lashing out in private messages that never reached me directly but made their way through mutual acquaintances, accusations about betrayal and loyalty, about how family disputes should never be handled in public, as if secrecy were a moral virtue rather than a convenience. My father said nothing, not to the press and not to me. And in that silence, I recognized the first true consequence he had ever faced, the loss of narrative control, because for the first time in his life, the story was being written by people who did not answer to him. Charges were not announced immediately, but the indicators were unmistakable. Expanded inquiries authorized additional subpoenas, issued timelines extended rather than narrowed, all signs of a case deepening rather than dissolving. Whitmore Biomedical's stock dipped sharply, then stabilized at a lower plateau, and the commentators who once praised decisive leadership began discussing governance failures and ethical oversight using phrases like systemic risk and organizational blind spots, phrases that sounded clinical but carried real weight. Employees I had never met reached out quietly through intermediaries, thanking me without saying my name, grateful that someone had finally disrupted a culture that rewarded silence over integrity. And their messages reminded me that consequences do not stop at the edges of a family. They ripple outward, touching people who had no seat at the table but paid the price for what happened there. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching this unfold, because justice does not arrive with fireworks when it is overdue. It arrives with paperwork schedules and a grinding insistence that truth be accounted for. I continued my work at the hospice, sat with families as they navigated loss, and found that my own grief had shifted shape, less sharp, more resolved, because the lie that had framed my life was being dismantled piece by piece, not through confrontation but through process. When I was finally contacted by counsel representing my father requesting a private meeting, I declined without hesitation, not out of spite but out of clarity, because consequences are weakened when they are negotiated prematurely, and I had learned that accountability requires distance to take hold. The most telling sign of all came weeks later when a federal notice was filed expanding the scope of the investigation to include criminal referrals, and the language, measured and precise, confirmed what had been building all along, that the systems my father had manipulated were now asserting themselves, indifferent to apology, unmoved by regret, and entirely focused on outcome. My father asked to see me after the criminal referrals became public, not through the confident channels he once used, but through a careful request delivered by an attorney who chose every word as if it might be weighed later. And I agreed only after insisting the meeting take place in a neutral setting, a small conference room at the courthouse, because private spaces had always favored him. When he entered, he looked older than his 71 years. Not frail, but diminished, as if the certainty that had carried him for decades had finally been taxed beyond repair, and for the first time in my life, he did not command the room he occupied it cautiously. He sat across from me with his hands folded, a gesture that felt rehearsed, and began by saying my name, the way a stranger might carefully, respectfully Eleanor, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. He spoke about misunderstanding, about how decisions had been made under pressure, about how the company had required strong leadership, and then gradually his language shifted from justification to confession, not of crimes but of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed, fear of a daughter whose integrity he could not bend. He said he had never meant to hurt me, a sentence that landed flat because intention does not erase outcome. And when he finally said he regretted calling me useless, his voice faltered in a way that might have once satisfied me, but now felt insufficient. I listened without interrupting, the way I listened to patients who spoke late truths when time was running out, and when he finished, I told him calmly that regret does not function as repair, that apologies do not rewind systems designed to exclude, and that whatever remorse he felt now belonged to him alone. He asked if there was anything he could do to make it right, and for a moment I considered how often I had asked myself that question over the years, how often I had tried to earn acknowledgement by giving more, yielding more, shrinking further, and I realized that the only honest answer was no. I told him that accountability was already in motion, that my involvement was no longer required, and that my work now was to ensure the truth remained intact, not to comfort him as he confronted its consequences. He looked at me, then really looked, and something like recognition flickered across his face. Not pride, not love, but an understanding that the daughter he had dismissed had become a force he could not influence. When the meeting ended, he stood and hesitated as if waiting for permission to speak again, then nodded once and left his steps measured, his posture guarded, and as the door closed, I felt a surprising lightness settle over me. Not because he had suffered, but because I no longer needed anything from him. Regret, I had learned, arrives most often when power is gone, and by the time it does, it cannot restore what was withheld. It can only acknowledge the cost of having withheld it. The final outcomes unfolded over months rather than days, because justice, when it is thorough, rarely rushes, and by the time the investigations concluded and the settlements and convictions were announced, the noise had quieted enough for meaning to emerge. My father was removed permanently from leadership, barred from serving in any executive capacity, and later entered a plea that acknowledged criminal responsibility without spectacle, a conclusion that satisfied the law, even if it never satisfied his conscience. My brothers faced their own consequences, reputations, fractured assets, reduced to what could be proven. Legitimate careers rerouted into obscurity rather than dominance, and while none of them went to prison, none of them escaped unchanged, because loss of status is its own sentence for people who build their identities on hierarchy. I was awarded control of the assets my mother had protected, not as a windfall, but as a correction, and I accepted them with the same seriousness I brought to every irreversible decision in my professional life, because money that arrives through truth carries an obligation that money born of manipulation never does. I returned to Asheville and used a portion of those funds to establish the Margaret Whitmore Hospice and Family Care Center, a place designed not for prestige but for dignity, where families could receive support without fear of cost or judgment, and where caregivers were treated as professionals rather than expendable labor. On the day the center opened, there were no cameras, no speeches, no applause, only patients, nurses, social workers, and a small plaque near the entrance bearing my mother's name, and a single sentence she once wrote in the margin of a notebook. Kindness is not weakness when it is chosen freely. I continued working there not as an executive removed from the work, but as a coordinator on the floor, because leadership that forgets the human cost of decisions eventually becomes dangerous, and I had seen firsthand where that path leads. Occasionally, people recognized my name from the news cycle that had long since moved on, and when they asked if I felt vindicated, I told them the truth. That vindication implies a contest of egos, and this had never been about winning. It had been about ending a lie that shaped lives without consent. My father never contacted me again after that meeting, and I did not reach out to him, not out of anger, but out of acceptance, because closure does not always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from alignment, from knowing that your life no longer bends around someone else's distortions. The most unexpected change came quietly in the way I moved through the world, no longer bracing for dismissal, no longer explaining my worth, because when you have been called useless publicly and survived, you learn that labels only hold power when you carry them forward. On the anniversary of the gala, I returned briefly to Atlanta for a conference on end-of-life care, and as I passed the hotel where my father had erased me, I felt no pull to go inside. No need to reclaim that space because the story it held no longer belonged to me. If you are hearing this and have ever been diminished by the people who were supposed to see you clearly, if you have been told your contributions did not count because they did not produce applause, understand this value is not assigned by those who benefit from your silence. It is revealed by what endures when the system that ignored you finally has to tell the truth. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was called useless in a room full of powerful people, and what followed was not revenge but accountability, not triumph but purpose, and that I have learned is a legacy no one can rewrite.